All right, guys, welcome. We're going to continue and conclude Unit 9 on the European Conquest. So, where we left off from the first half is this question that we shouldn't take for granted. A lot of things in life, whether it's our personal lives or in big historical events, hindsight's 2020, so after the fact, something might seem obvious. But when the Spanish and then other Europeans quote, discovered the Americas and started traveling here more often, even if that had happened the way it did, the idea that they were able to conquer and hold two continents would have been not likely at all. All right. That would have not seemed like a remote possibility, but it happened. And it happened in the Americas in a way that it didn't happen anywhere else. So how did that happen? Um, Many different Native American civilizations were almost entirely wiped out for reasons we'll get to in a minute. On that point, though, I want to stipulate there's a lot of misunderstanding in mythology about pre-Columbian America, what was going on in the Americas before Europeans and other outsiders showed up. Native American civilization wasn't one thing. All right, it was civilizations plural. There were a huge variety of many different types of civilizations. Some nomadic hunter-gathering groups, some small scale agricultural societies, and some huge, enormous urban and empires and everything in between. So it wasn't just one thing, and that's important to understand. But how were the Spanish able to conquer, for example, the Aztec Empire? And there were other empires, the Inca, the Maya, but the Aztecs, I mean, these are not primitive people. These are not small groups of hunter-gatherers that are easily, defeated by a technologically advanced society. Um, when the Spanish, for example, first showed up at the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, which is where modern Mexico City is centered, when they first showed up at the Aztec capital and saw that city, they were shocked. Right. The Spanish wouldn't have thought, oh, we can roll these people. No, no, no. They were shocked, amazed, horrified, probably. The Aztec capital would have been the biggest, most populated, cleanest, best run, best constructed city that the average Spanish person had ever seen in their lives by a lot. So how on earth can a handful of people conquer this big advanced empire? And there were a couple of reasons, a couple main reasons. One was political and the other was biological. So and the biological one was infinitely more important. But the political reason, the Mexica or Aztec state religion necessitated constant warfare against neighboring peoples, other Native American tribes and societies, to secure captives for religious sacrifices and laborers. Okay, so the Aztec Empire was an empire, just like any other empire. We talked about the Roman Empire. What did they do? They expanded and conquered their neighbors, and they weren't polite about it. Same thing with the Aztecs. So the Aztecs, like any other empire, expanded at the expense of their neighbors. And what did they do to their fellow Native Americans? What did the Aztecs do? They secured captives for religious sacrifices and laborers. Securing captives for laborers, that is a overly polite way of saying enslaving their neighbors. Securing captives for religious sacrifices is an overly polite way of saying capturing their neighbors so that they could rip their still beating hearts out of their chests before cutting their heads off and throwing them down the side of a pyramid. So, There's an old phrase in history and in our personal lives that you should be familiar with. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? A lot of human relationships are founded on mutual hatred of a third party. The enemy of my enemy is my friends. What does it have to do with this scenario? Many Native American groups allied with the Spanish and later the French and the English. Many Native Americans sided with Europeans. Now, why would they do that? Don't they know the Europeans are the enemy? Well, depends on the context. If you are a Native American group that lives on the edge of the Aztec Empire, you would hate and fear the Aztecs. Okay? And in this scenario, if the Spanish show up and the Spanish are interested in conquering the Aztecs, you as a Native American may make the following calculation. I don't know who these Spanish people are. I don't know where they came from. They're kind of funny looking. Never seen a white person before. Never seen a horse before. Don't know, don't care. They can't be worse than the Aztecs. So this is a lot more complex than it's often portrayed. The enemy of my enemy is my friends. Again, many Native Americans sided with the Spanish against other Native Americans for internal political reasons. And also, we should take a moment here to dispel a certain very common myth. Beware of the myth that people were peaceful and innocent before these events. Okay? Very, very common myth. And the myth goes to something like this. Before the Spanish showed up in the Americas, the Native Americans were living in this kind of utopian setting, and they were all at peace with each other and with nature, and they respected the environment and, all this kind of sitting around the campfire holding hands. This very idyllic, romanticized version of what life would have been like in the Americas before the Spanish showed up. And then the myth continues that utopian Garden of Eden situation was destroyed when the Spanish showed up. Now, did everything go to hell for the Native Americans after the Spanish showed up? Oh, yeah, that part is true. This is the thing about myths. They work because there's always an element of truth. The idea that things went terribly wrong for all Native Americans after the Europeans showed up, that's true. But that doesn't mean that before that event, everything was perfect. That is false. It's intellectually lazy, and it's kind of patronizing, frankly, towards the Native Americans. Before the Europeans showed up, before Native Americans knew that Europeans even existed, what were they doing? Well, they were doing what people were doing everywhere else in the world. Occasionally, quite often actually, enslaving and killing each other, unfortunately. Just a quick thought exercise. Imagine these events happened in reverse. In other words, imagine the Aztecs, quote, discovered Europe, for example. What if the Native Americans discovered Europe rather than the opposite way around? What would the Native Americans have found in Europe? Would they have found a bunch of Europeans sitting together around the campfire, holding hands, singing songs? Or would they have found Europeans who might look alike to the outsider? Would they have found Europeans killing each other at scale over, you name it, religious differences, economic motives, political disputes? You know what they would have found. So, right, understand Native American civilization before these events, number one, it was way more complex and diverse than is usually portrayed. And number two, it was human. And that included all the flaws that went along with that. So that's the political angle. By far, the more significant reason that the Europeans were able to do what they did was a biological reason. Within a century of European contact, at least 80%, a lot of sources say 90%, but let's say at least 80, at least 80% of Native Americans had died. Um, that is the most catastrophic number in recorded history by a lot. By comparison, during the Holocaust, about one third, let's say at the high end, 40% of Jews were killed, were murdered. 40%. Well, the percentage of Native Americans who died, not murdered, died, was more than double what the Jews suffered in the Holocaust. It is, to just put it simply, the worst thing that's ever happened to any group of people anywhere, ever, and it's not close. How did this happen? Almost all of these deaths, statistically, 90+%, were caused by disease, not physical violence. They died. They weren't murdered. There is a difference. Maybe it's not an important difference, but there is a difference. And because if you think about the vectors of how germs move and how diseases spread, you don't need a European to physically carry the disease to different groups of Native Americans. Once the diseases were introduced into one part of Native American society, the Native Americans would have spread the disease within the Native American civilizations just through day-to-day life of travel, business, and everything else. So a huge number of Native Americans would have died from these diseases without even knowing that the Europeans were there or existed. And I want to make clear to stipulate something. When we say Native Americans here, we're talking about every person from Alaska to Argentina, two continents, and the Caribbean. All of them, 80, 90% dead within 100 years. Most catastrophic thing that's ever happened. We'll get more into the specifics about why that happens in the Americas and nowhere else. Now, one interesting thing, obviously this isn't from the Americas, but I'm using it to compare and contrast something. We know now, 500 years later, about the extent of pre-Columbian, pre-European contact Native American civilizations than we did 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago. A lot of the evidence and knowledge of the level of Native American civilizations, about how complex and sophisticated they were, a lot of that evidence was lost to history almost entirely. And now, because of certain new technology that we have, we're actually learning more than we knew way back when these events were actually happening. So here's why not just the people died, but the evidence of how advanced they were. The evidence disappeared too, in a way that doesn't happen in other parts of the world. So here's an example. One of the Great Pyramids at Giza in Egypt, maybe the single most iconic structure ever built by humans, even though we all know it was aliens. But I digress. Um, in all seriousness, right? If you had to pick one structure that is the most well-known iconic structure built by humans, it's probably what you're looking at here. Okay. This building was built about 5,000 years ago. If the people that built this building all died of a disease, let's say, the day after they finished building the pyramid, would the building still be here today? In other words, would the evidence of their civilization survive even though the people died? And in this case, with the Great Pyramid, the answer is yes. If every human in Egypt died as soon as this building was completed, and then 5,000 years later, someone shows up in Egypt, this building would still be there. And frankly, it would probably be in better condition than it is because there wouldn't have been people over the centuries plundering it and climbing it and whatever else. But that building would still be there. In other words, the obvious evidence of an extinct, incredibly advanced civilization would still be there and it would be obvious for us to learn from. Why would it still be there? Because of the climate. It's incredibly dry, it's incredibly arid, it almost never rains. I'm repeating myself. There's no plant life growing up around it. There's no vines covering it up. There's no root systems growing underneath it, messing up the foundation. There's no freezing and warming that are going to warp the material. Because of the environment in Egypt, that building, that evidence of the civilization, will survive for thousands of years after the civilization is gone. It's an amazing thing, right? So we can't deny the sophistication of ancient Egypt civilization. Now, in a lot of the Americas, the situation is very different because the climate is very different. The environment is very different. So when 90% of the Native Americans die, why does the evidence of what they built also disappear? The Great Pyramid didn't disappear. Why do so many things in the Americas disappear? The environment. This is a photograph from about 100 years ago of a mountaintop in Peru. And you could be up on this incredibly remote mountain, and maybe you're just going for a walk, and you start noticing, see kind of in the center of the picture here, lower left-hand corner, lower right-hand corner, you might start noticing clear evidence of man-made structures. You might say, boy, that's interesting. That's obviously a wall. It's obviously man-made. What's up with that? Apparently, there were people here at one time. And because the foliage is so thick, number one, it'd be really hard to stumble across something like this because you could be 100 feet away from one of these structures and not know it because the foliage is so thick. Contrast with this, you could be a mile away from that thing and you can see it. It's right there. And so the elements, the plant life, would swallow up buildings in this context here in a way that in this context is not going to happen, right? And so as people realized, man, this is strange. There are buildings on top of this mountain in a very inhospitable climate, and those buildings have been swallowed up by the elements. And people got interested and started clearing more and more of the growth. And you know what they realized this was? This was this. This was Machu Picchu. It was a city that was not only swallowed up by the elements, but it was built in a place where Europeans didn't even imagine anyone could build anything. The air is incredibly thin up there. And more to the point, it's on top of a freaking mountain. How do you even get the building supplies up there? So Europeans, they wouldn't even been looking for something like this in a place like that. But you know what? It was there, and it was kind of swallowed up by history for a couple hundred years. But now we know about it. Now, in the more modern context, I want to break out and look something up for you. This is worth taking a minute for. Um, Let us go to our friends at Google. There is a new technology called LIDAR, LIDAR. This is how we're discovering even more. And it's used to great effect in the Amazon. So the Amazon rainforest, here's a good one. The Amazon rainforest, as you probably know, is a jungle, the rainforest. It's enormous, right? It's like the size of the United States, right? It's incomprehensibly huge. Now, if you were, I can't open up this link because I don't have Facebook because, I'm a civilized human. But if you look at this image right here, right? If you are looking for evidence of an ancient civilization in the Amazon, how are you going to do that? If you do it on foot, you're walking through the biggest jungle on Earth and it's incredibly thick, and the chances you're going to randomly find something statistically are very, very slim. Well, now we can fly over it and look down, right? Okay, great. If you fly over the Amazon, what are you going to see? Nothing. You're going to see green. You're going to see the tree canopy. That's it. But now we have something called LIDAR, which is a type of radar that can basically, all the good ones are on Facebook. What's that about? That are basically X-ray vision. And so now we can fly over, the biggest jungle on Earth and look down from a plane with these specific types of lenses and cameras, and the camera can look through the organic material. It can look through the leaves to see if there's anything man-made underneath. And that technology has been used to find in the middle of a jungle where Europeans didn't think you could really build anything, huge, you name it, temples, road networks, incredibly sophisticated irrigation systems, cities. LiDAR reveals settlements of a lost civilization. Laser mapping uncovers oldest Amazonian cities ever found, built over 2,500 years ago. So because of the new technology we have now, specifically that LiDAR thing, we have way more information about the sophistication of Native American civilizations than we ever did. It's an amazing thing. The Spanish and others, but the Spanish were leading this early on, plundered huge amounts of gold and silver from the Americas. And in the short term, they got really rich, and in the medium and long term, they destroyed their economy for hundreds of years. We've covered inflation before. If you artificially introduce huge amounts of money into your economy over a very short period, you're not getting rich. You're inflating your currency into worthless scraps. So Spain destroyed their economy by plundering so much wealth so quickly and just dumping it into their country. Someone somewhere once said the wages of sin is death. European governments, so this is the economic system that the Europeans set up that lasted hundreds of years. European governments gave monopolies, we talked about monopolies before, to favored corporations, and what evolved eventually into something you've probably heard of, the triangle trade. Colonies were only allowed to sell raw materials to the mother country. I don't think we've used these terms in this course specifically, so I'm going to walk you through what those words mean, and then I'm going to plug in specific examples from the time so that you understand how this system worked. A raw material is a natural resource. It's something of value that exists in nature. Okay. A colony is a place that's conquered by an empire. The mother country is the center of the empire. And a manufactured good is something of value that's made out of the raw material, something that doesn't exist in nature. It needs to be manufactured out of raw materials. Colonies were only allowed to sell raw material to the mother country. So let me walk you through an example from the time that we can see depicted on this graphic here. Cuba, for example, was a colony of the Spanish Empire. So let's plug in Cuba as an example of a colony. Cuba could only sell raw materials to the mother country. In this case, the mother country of Cuba would have been Spain for 400 years. Cuba was only allowed to sell raw material to Spain, for example. And you can see on this graphic that white arrow of raw materials going from the Caribbean to Europe. Okay. An example of a raw material at the time, well, they still have it, it's still valuable. A valuable raw material that Cuba would have had at the time, for example, would have been sugar. The climate and geography of Cuba is ideal for producing lots of sugar, and sugar is very valuable. Cuba was only allowed to sell sugar to Spain. Now, in a monopoly, and in a system like this, if you have something of value, you're Cuba, you have sugar, you want to sell it, but you have to sell it to one buyer and one buyer only. What type of price are you going to be paid for your sugar? In this case, you will be paid an unfairly, artificially low price. Because if you say to Spain, if you're Cuba and you say to Spain, hey, our sugar is worth twice this much, we're going to sell it to someone else that'll give us a much better price. Spain will say, no, you're not. We have a gun to your head. We have a monopoly. You're our colony. You're going to sell it to us for what we feel like giving you. So, right, you can see how that would have been manipulated. And then in this example, I'll keep walking you through it. What manufactured good can you make from the raw material sugar? Well, at the time, there's different ones, but at the time, for example, a very valuable one would have been rum. Rum is not a natural resource or raw material. It doesn't rain Bacardi. You have to manufacture rum. It's a manufactured good. So colonies were only allowed to buy manufactured goods from the mother country. So again, I'll plug in examples. Cuba was only allowed to buy rum from Spain. So same thing. If you are Cuba and you have to buy a product from one seller and one seller only, what kind of price will you be charged? An unfairly artificially high price. And if you are Cuba and you say to Spain, hey, you're charging me twice as much for my Captain Morgan as you should be, I can get it somewhere else for cheaper. Spain will say, no, you can't. We have a monopoly. We have a gun to your head. You will pay what we want and you will like it. So in this case, hopefully you can see Cuba's getting ripped off. Whatever colony we're talking about, it's getting ripped off on both parts of this exchange by the mother country. As the Native Americans who were enslaved die off of disease, that's where the third part of the triangle comes in, which is slaves from West Africa, which were sent to the Caribbean primarily. And the slaves didn't die of disease for reasons we'll get into in a minute. So that completes the triangle trade. This is not capitalism. It's what's called mercantilism. Um, this involves slavery, capitalism, or not capitalism, rather, monopoly, price fixing, all kinds of practices that violate the principles of capitalism. All right, so it's mercantilism. Which, to be clear, is not to say that capitalists have never enslaved people or fixed prices or run monopolies. They have, but in principle, you're not supposed to do any of that in a capitalist system. So this is what's referred to as mercantilism. We'll get into this a little bit more in the next unit. So for hundreds of years, this is how it worked. Sugar was harvested in Cuba, for example, sent to Spain, where it was manufactured into rum. The Spanish would then fill up a ship with rum, big crates of rum, sail that ship down to the coast of West Africa, make contact with West African tribes who had enslaved their neighbors, trade a bunch of rum for a bunch of slaves, and those slaves would be sent where? To Cuba. To do what? To produce sugar. Why? Well, the Spanish need more sugar to make into more rum, to trade for more slaves, to make more sugar. So it becomes a cycle for hundreds of years. So the Columbian Exchange, let me jump ahead a little bit. Okay. Columbian Exchange. This is the term given to the exchange, the back and forth between the two hemispheres, East and West. And so basically, these are things that had never existed on one half of the earth or the other before Columbus. And Columbus starts the process of people and goods and products coming back and forth in a way that hadn't happened since the last ice age. So, for example, on the upper arrow here that goes from the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa, it's mostly food products, but these are things that never existed in Europe, Asia, or Africa. They only existed in the Americas until this back and forth began, starting with Columbus. So, in other words, no one in Europe, Asia, or Africa had ever eaten a potato, ever. They didn't exist. They only existed in the Americas. So, as I walk you through this, think about, let's think about the two hemispheres, East and West, as different planets. They're different planets with totally different ecosystems. Okay. And all of a sudden, aliens from Europe land in the Americas and they start exchanging goods. Oh, I've never seen this before. Never seen. All right, so the Europeans show up. What is that? Oh, it's a potato. Oh, wow. All right. So the things that only existed in the Americas and now exist everywhere, some of them are listed there, and it's mostly food, and that is important. All right. Specifically, the big ones there would be potatoes, corn, and beans. Potatoes, corn, and beans for specific dietary reasons are some of the most important foods on Earth in terms of how easy they are to grow, how cheap they are, and how, in terms of being nutrient rich, these are the three most important staples for human beings worldwide, especially poor people. And so potatoes, corns, and beans have saved hundreds of millions of people in Europe, Asia, and Africa since these events from starvation. The majority of food consumed by all humans today is food that used to only exist in the Americas. So that's kind of a big deal. What is much more world changing is what flowed in the opposite direction. All right. So the lower arrow moving from east to west, these are things that never existed in the Americas before the Europeans started bringing them over. And again, there's some food. Okay, that's interesting. That's not world changing. Here's what's world changing: the disease. Why did those diseases never exist in the Americas? Because most diseases originate in and are carried to some degree by animals. And the animals listed there didn't exist in the Americas. There were no cows in the Americas before Columbus. None. There were zero cows. Why? I don't know. Cows can't swim across the ocean. That's why. So since there were no cows, there were also no germs that cows carry, for example. Do you see where this is going? Europeans, Asians, and Africans had lived with, worked with, drank the milk of domesticated animals for thousands of years, like cows. So Europeans, Asians, and Africans for thousands of years have been exposed to illnesses carried by these animals. And if you understand how biology works, that means that those gene pools, Europeans, Asians, and Africans, had developed over time a certain degree of natural immunity through exposure to all of those diseases. And they passed on those immunities to their children. In the Americas, no Native Americans had ever been exposed to any of those diseases listed there because they did not ever have any exposure to any of the animals, sheep, pigs, etc., that carry those germs. And what happens when you introduce a deadly disease into a population with zero prior exposure and therefore zero natural immunity? You know what happens? 80 to 90% of them die before they can develop immunity that they can hand on to their children and grandchildren. Does that make sense? Columbus and those who followed him may as well have been aliens from another country, or from another planet, rather. It didn't matter what their intentions were. As soon as they stepped off that ship and started breathing without knowing what they were doing, they were introducing pathogens into a virgin environment with no prior exposure. And at that moment, it was already too late for the Native Americans. That is why this unbelievably catastrophic die-off didn't happen anywhere else. Other places have been conquered, but only one place has been emptied of its indigenous people, and that's the Americas. And this is going to sound ridiculous. It's because of cows and sheep. It's not because of Columbus. It's not. You can condemn him for any number of reasons. Shout it from the rooftop, have fun, no problem. It was sheep. And that seems absurd, and it is, but that's the biological explanation for what happens. There's an old rhetorical exercise of, if you can go back in time and change one thing in history that you think would radically change everything since, what would that be, right? And the low-hanging fruit is I'd go kill baby Hitler. If you could change one thing from all of history that would most radically change everything that happened after that, you know what you should do? Go back like 2,000 years and randomly drop some cows and pigs into Mexico. That's it. And let them do their cow and pig thing and walk around and reproduce and blah, blah, blah. And in that scenario, Native Americans would have been exposed to these germs over centuries. And when the Spanish showed up, if everything happened the exact same way, if the Native Americans had exposure and immunity to those germs, some of them would have died. There would have been war. There would have been some conquest, sure. But to this day, 80 to 90% of the humans living in the United States, for example, would be Native American. It's crazy, unprecedented, and something that people didn't do. It was germs. De las Casas was a Spanish priest who I wouldn't be surprised if he came up in your high school history textbook. He is well known and respected by many for being rare in the sense that he condemned his own country and his own government for their treatment of the Native Americans. He defended the humanity of the Native Americans at a time when many Spanish weren't. And in his account of the destruction of what they called the Indies, um, he he called out his own people, and that's hard to do, right? That takes moral courage. And his account is one of the earliest written accounts by the Spanish that catalogs the just the devastation of Native American societies. And he defended their humanity and, among other things, argued that they should not be enslaved. And he is respected for being one of the few Europeans to make that case. Now, this next issue is of great importance for you to understand and consider. And the reason it comes up now is that this is what motivated De las Casas, this idea of cultural relativism. So De las Casas, basically what he argued was, look, Native American cultures are radically different from Spanish culture in many, many ways. Okay. But he said, look at this quote on the left. Just because our Spanish culture is different from Native American culture doesn't mean we are superior to them. Cultures are different. Let's stipulate that. Anyone who says that they're all the same is lying. Cultures are different. Okay. The relativism debate is about, or we all know cultures are different. Does that mean that one is better or worse than the other? And that gets tricky. That gets spicy. That gets controversial. And so De las Casas was motivated by empathy. That's an important skill. It's an important practice for all of us. Empathy. Just because people are different doesn't mean we're better than them. We need to empathize and respect different ideas, values, etc. That's a virtue. We need that to have a civilization. We need to empathize with each other who are different than we are in any number of ways. That's a virtue. And that's what motivated De las Casas. Just because the Native Americans are different from us doesn't mean that we're better than them. Good. Let's stipulate that we all agree that that's a virtue. Empathizing with people who look differently, think differently, believe differently, right? That's good. Here's the thing. It's good up to a point. And where is that point, as always, is up for you to assess as an individual. So cultural relativists claim the following. Number one, different societies have different moral codes. Duh, that's just a statement of fact. Number two, the moral society of code determines what blah, blah, that's just a definition. Number three, here's where it gets important. There are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. If you are a full-blown cultural relativist and you have no line, you will agree with number three. So try this on for size. Do you personally agree with this idea? There are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. Do you agree with that? Is there any, in other words, is there any action or behavior that, in your opinion, is always wrong, regardless of who does it, regardless of the reason? Is there any action that, in your opinion, is always wrong? Because full-blown cultural and moral relativists say that there's no such thing as universal truth or morality. You should think about that. If I tell you someone murdered a 3-year-old, are you comfortable saying, okay, I have enough information. That's wrong. That's evil. End of story. I don't need more information. I don't need to ask follow-up questions. I don't need to know about the context. It is always wrong to murder a 3-year-old. Are you comfortable saying that? Or are you going to go down the full-blown relativist road of, well, gee, that sounds bad, but who am I to judge? Maybe there's some cultural reason that I don't really want to. That's the question, okay? Where's the line? Where's the line between empathy and there's such a thing as suicidal empathy? Um, Number four, the moral code of our society is no special status, one among many. That's just reinforcing the quote on the left. Number five, it is arrogant for us to judge other cultures. We should always be tolerant of them. Again, this sounds so great on paper. Arrogant, that's bad. We don't want to be arrogant. Judgmental, that has a negative connotation. We don't want to be judgmental. Tolerant, that has a positive connotation. We want to be tolerant. Agreed? Great. If I ask you, is it evil to murder children? And you say yes, should I then reply that you are being arrogant and judgmental and intolerant? Is that how that works? Sometimes we need to be judgmental, do we not? Slavery is evil. There, I said it. Does that make me, quote, judgmental? Does that make me intolerant of slave owners? Should Jews tolerate Nazis? If you never, quote, judge, and if you tolerate every belief, you will tolerate yourself into a ditch with a bullet in your head. So there's that. So this is a beautiful idea of really virtuous things like empathy and tolerance, which we need. But since life is complicated, you can't just end it there. You personally need to think about up until what point? Where's the line? Where's the line at which point we have to be, quote, judgmental and say, yeah, you know what, you're evil. There were a couple headlines from the last few years that have come up earlier when I taught this course in person, when we've had this discussion. Uh, U.S. soldier punished for stopping child rape by Afghan. And during the war in Afghanistan, there was a certain Afghan tribe. Afghanistan's an incredibly diverse country. There's a lot going on there. There's a certain tribe in Afghanistan that had a cultural practice going back hundreds and hundreds of years of men having sex with boys. And in that specific tribal culture, that wasn't taboo. It wasn't considered aberrational or evil or wrong. Okay, fine. That's their culture. And look, ancient Greeks did this. This specific act has been practiced by many cultures throughout history. Okay. Um, there were several cases, not just one, where American soldiers witnessed this behavior and intervened and attacked a man for, in the cultural frame of the American soldier, we would refer to this not as some cultural practice. We would refer to this as child rape, right? That's what most Americans would refer to this as. We have cultural values about age of consent, right? And in this case, the American soldier was punished by our own military for attacking this man in Afghanistan who was having sex with this boy. And basically, the reason the soldier was punished was cultural relativism, right? Our military's policy was, look, we might not like that cultural practice of this specific group in Afghanistan, but we're not here to judge and change their culture. We're here to win a war. Are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable saying, I don't want to be arrogant and judgmental and, you know, uh, intolerant towards adults who have sex with kids? Or are you comfortable saying, yeah, no, that's inferior? Iran executes gay teenager in violation of international law. My friends, there is no such thing as international law. They are but words on a piece of paper. International law is whatever you can get away with. That caveat aside, Iran executes gay teenager. Why is the headline pointing out the sexual orientation of the teenager? How is that relevant? It's relevant because of the crime that this teenager was convicted of. The crime that this teenager was convicted of was being gay in Iran under the current regime, which, depending on when you're watching this, may no longer exist. In Iran, under the Islamic Republic, homosexual behavior carries, in many cases, the death penalty. Same question. Where's your line? Forced abortion still mandated under China's planned birth laws. The Chinese Communist Party implemented decades ago the one-child policy. Now it's the two-child policy. The government is in charge of how many children you have. You should think about that. And how do they enforce that policy? Forced abortion. Even if you are super, super, super pro-choice, are you comfortable with forced abortion? Um, Before we move on, I want to make one very important stipulation. This isn't a one-way street. Our culture engages in many practices that other cultures condemn and judge us for. So the question for you to consider, great importance, when, in your opinion, is it appropriate to judge, not just notice differences between cultures, but to call out certain uh, behavior as morally superior or inferior to others? When are you comfortable doing that? And again, this isn't about us as Americans pointing fingers at everybody else. We also need to do some soul searching and look at our own culture and be willing to do that with ourselves, right? Last couple things come up just mainly because of the timeline that we're on. Shakespeare. Everyone's heard of Shakespeare. Personally, I don't get it. I'm not a huge fan. If you had to read him in high school, I can relate. If you enjoyed it, I'm happy for you. If you didn't, I feel you. But he is considered by many people who understand literature. I don't, but many more sophisticated people than I. He is very often referred to as the greatest author in the history of the English language. One of the things I find fascinating about him is this. He invented words. So English is a very dynamic language, and it grows more than other languages. There are always words being added to English in a way that doesn't really obtain with some other languages, not to the same degree. So this is a short list of words that show up in English for the first time in Shakespeare's writing. And if you want to trace this to today, to current events, any given year, you can, go to our friends at Google and look up what words were added to the dictionary this year. And in recent years, it's very often stuff that I'm way too old to comprehend. It's a lot of them aren't even words. Um, they're just well, first of all, a lot of it is predicated on internet activity. Let me look this up. Um, a lot of it has to do with slang from social media and things like that. Um, yeah, let's just key things. Um, every year as our society changes, new words are going to be added to reflect how society is changing, whether it's Shakespeare 500 years ago or things going on now in our culture. Agentic, see, the words d describing AI. Obviously, those words wouldn't have existed 10 years ago because AI didn't exist. Um, internet culture. Obviously, this would be a recent subset of words. Skibbity. They don't explain what that means. Um, oh, God help us. I can't even. Uh, look through this list. It's interesting. It says a lot about our culture. And again, for hundreds and hundreds of years, as society gets more complex and new technology is introduced, and new cultural practices, etc., there's going to be new words. Last thing, in the 1600s, Protestants, so this is again connected to the Protestant Reformation, obviously, from England, began to settle in New England. Makes sense. Religious disputes in Massachusetts. So, very often the religious disputes in Europe, driven by the Reformation, very often the immigrants brought their religious disputes here. Religious disputes in Massachusetts led to the dispersion of settlers into new communities, the new communities of Providence, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. I don't know where you all live. I grew up in Providence. If you're familiar with this region or not, you might notice that in this quote, Providence and Rhode Island are listed as two separate places, because at the time they were. Rhode Island is not an island. It's a great example of something that's so in your face, like, wait, what? But as a native Rhode Islander, I can tell you nobody ever thinks about this. Why is our state called something island when we're not an island? The reason is at the time, number one on this map, Aquidneck Island, which actually is, an island, that was Rhode Island. And then later, part of the mainland was added, very small part, but still, that's what that's about. More importantly, to tie together things that have come up earlier in the course, first of all, this is connected to the Protestant Reformation, which we covered recently, and to go all the way back to the Roman Empire when we talked about Constantine very briefly had what we would describe as freedom of religion or toleration of all religions. Rhode Island was, from a certain point of view, I've heard this debated, but as a Rhode Islander, I'm gonna latch onto this. A former Rhode Islander. Um, Rhode Island essentially became the first place on earth to guarantee freedom of religion for all religions and have it actually last. Most of the early colonies did not have freedom of religion. Rhode Island did in a way that didn't exist anywhere else in the world and in a way which actually lasted to this day. Evidence of that, if you look at Aquidneck Island, again, number one on the map here, Newport, Rhode Island is home to the oldest Jewish synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. And that's why. So that's it for this unit. There are two more to go. We'll see you next time.